Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. I'm in the studio today with Amy Lunardi. Amy, how's life? How you doing?
You've already started off with a bit of a tongue twister there, Chris.
That's all right.
It's going to be a great episode.
Done thousands of these. There's no point trying to be perfect, but
Not
how's
at all.
life?
We've given up on perfect, haven't we?
Yeah, what's been going on? I mean, you're in the double parent life like me. And what's been happening?
I'm just, trying to protect the baby from the 2.5-year-old. It's really a full-time job, isn't it? Just making sure that the little one's safe and, not receiving any projectiles thrown at his head as well.
Getting cheap shots in, I call it. My daughter has been doing that with Tommy, my boy, for like a few years, but now Tommy's almost as tall, and we just kept saying he's going to get bigger, and then now
he's going to fight back.
Yeah, she's pretty much crying every morning because he's hurting her. Like this morning was a magnetic tile to the ear, pinching, it's all sorts. So 2 boys you've got, so I think wrestling's not far away.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I bought a big crash pad for them recently so they can just get the energy out and jump around. But it's certainly going from 1 to 2 kids. I wouldn't say it's double the work, but it's definitely adds to the different dynamic. And being back at work, and my husband works full time, and we're both real estate agents, so we're answering the phones out of hours and working Saturdays as well. So the juggle is real, but I have to say I love it. I really, really enjoy it, but I love being back at work and being in the real world. But yes, it's just that age-old work-life balance question, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our listeners today, we're going to talk about private sales. I mean, how to make an offer. I mean, huge topic. We'll probably sprinkle a little bit of Melbourne market updates because I'm quite interested in that.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, what's been going on?
I've got things to say about the Melbourne market. It has been, in my experience, going crazy. And now this is not across the board because there are some agents in some areas I've been speaking to that disagree with me and they say, oh no, it's not quite picked up in my area. But for the inner suburbs and for the properties I've been looking at recently for clients, there have been a couple of sales which have gone for 10 to 15% more than what they would have sold for the last quarter of last year.
Right.
So just the strength, the sentiment, the numbers of buyers walking through properties, I know that doesn't always translate into active buyers. There can be a lot of sticky beakers out there, but everything has definitely picked up. So we're having to now factor this into our searches. I'm absolutely needing to factor this into my appraisals. So when we do a comparable sales analysis, we say, what's the on-paper value? And then we need to overlay current market conditions, especially because many properties we're comparing to have sold late last year. So Melbourne, it's picked up again, not 100% across the board, but the clearance rates also reflect that as well.
It's interesting. What you're sort of talking about is like that flick of the switch, right? Like late last year, amazing buying conditions, right? Not as much competition, particularly on good assets you potentially could secure, which is a great market to be buying in. 3 months later, one rate cut, and all of a sudden buyers are a bit of FOMO, and prices can run really hard, really fast, particularly in somewhere that has underperformed for some time where it's comparatively, it feels, good value. And so do you think that the buyers have just, because that really hard as a buyer, so that's really hard to know what to offer, which is what we're going to talk about today, is because do you base it on 2024? Well, probably not. You have to you have to be going to auctions and knowing what, how much interest on properties on the market right now. And because even auctions is only few and far between so far this year. So, I mean, how do you want to crack on with today? I mean, what's your sort of,
so just to comment on that, this is all the more reason why you have to be really immersed in the market and have a pulse on what's going on, track property sale prices, and be comparing them to similar properties that have sold a couple of months ago. That's really the only way to be able to compare, because if you're living in 2024 prices, you're not going to have a competitive advantage. And even if you haven't been doing this, very quickly you'll realize once you start trying to put offers in and going to auctions, if everything keeps going out of reach, well, you're going to have to adjust expectations regardless. So yes, in Melbourne, like you said, Chris, it's been very slow, very stagnant for a little while, dropping in areas as well. And now, even though this rate cut, it hasn't put much more money in people's pockets. It hasn't necessarily increased borrowing capacity by that much, but it's sentiment. Sentiment is so powerful. And we have a lot of the people who were the fence sitters, people who was just saying, wait and see what happens. And that combined with a fresh year, I always feel like February starts off with a lot more people walking through properties because they've had a bit of a break, new year, new property.
Yeah.
All of that just builds momentum. So, okay, on to private sales. And this is going to be a really juicy episode because private sales, I'll tell you one thing, and it's kind of scary, but it's just reality. There are no rules, Chris. There are no rules for a private sale in comparison to auctions, which have very strict rules. And for the purpose of this episode, private sales are also applicable to off-market properties because they're private sales. But we're not going to be talking about putting offers in for pre-auction offers, for example. We're going to save that for an upcoming episode where we deep dive into auctions.
It's funny, right? I was on a call with a client this week and, I actually tried to convince them not to buy this property. So they know that. We know that. But, one of the parties in the couple really wanted it, and which is fair enough. And so we had that chat. They've come back and they said, look, no, we're going to go ahead. We're going to get us your advice to consider it. And there's lots of reasons why. I wasn't playing the role of a buyer's agent. I was just highlighting my concerns, busy road, the type of property it was, etc. And, I think you could do better. And, hey, here's a buyer's agent you should speak to. So that's what I did. But they were like, well, what do I do now? I'm like,
yeah,
well, you got to make an offer. And
they're like, how?
And and what's the process? What's the, and I think this is a really interesting point is that every agent does things differently. There's different tactics. There's different strategies. There's, do you get the strata report check now? Do you do a building and pest? Like there's a real minefield and there's no like strict way to, so how do you approach this point of view? What's the first step in your mind, right? You like the property. You think it matches what the client's brief is. They're keen. You're keen. What do you do?
Okay. All right. Well, before I explain how to put an offer in, because that's a bit of a more technical thing, I'm going to just talk about private sales a little bit more so that you can understand what is going on here and what kind of situations you might encounter. Because, an agent might say to you, okay, cool, come and put an offer in. But the agents often forget that buyers have no idea what they're doing because how would they know? There's no, set guide anywhere that you can follow. And yes, agents often forget this. So you need to understand first and foremost, every real estate agency might have a different policy in how they handle private sales. And sometimes then even each agent within each agency might have a different way they do things, or it can depend on the property and depend on the vendor. So just because you've gone through one process with Ray White, John from Ray White one property, doesn't mean next time you buy off John from Ray White, he's going to do the same thing. So you always have to clarify at the start. And when I say process, there could be varying types of processes with a private sale. For example, you might put an offer in and it will go backwards and forwards. That, hey, Chris, the other buyers put in $1 million. What do you want to do? You say, okay, I'll give you another 10. They go backwards and forwards. I had one just the other day. We just went backwards and forwards until I said, nope, I'm out. That can be really complicated if you've got multiple parties, because who's that agent going to call first? What's fair? That becomes really complicated. And that also becomes really complicated when you've got multiple buyers on different terms. Because if I'm unconditional, Chris, and you've got finance and building inspection,
big point.
And we're going backwards and forwards, well, those are two very different offers. Sometimes the vendor might say, I don't care about terms, it's just about price. But then in other situations, when I've got a really strong unconditional offer and someone else doesn't, you can't do it backwards and forwards. So another common method or process in a private sale is a best and highest. And can you guess what that means, Chris?
Oh, I don't like this. It's put it in an envelope and cross your fingers and no transparency. And gives me anxiety just thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. So when we say envelope, it's not an actual envelope.
Yeah.
But you get one shot in some instances. You put in your best offer and you're not going to get a call back if someone beats you. I don't love it. In most situations, it's not transparent. You don't have any other, validation, and there's always that fear of overpaying. But at the same time, you say, oh, well, if I knew someone else was going to go up higher, maybe I would in comparison to an auction. But in some situations, I prefer the process because if I already think that that property is probably going to be a bit over my budget, I've actually got nothing to lose.
That's true.
And other people might come in less than what they were going to pay. It's not always terrible, but sometimes you'll also have a bit more complicated best and highest processes. Like the agent will say, okay, Chris, if you give me the first offer, you get the last chance to beat all of the other offers. And in that instance, they might disclose the other offers and they might not. They might just say, hey, Chris, you've got to come up. And in other situations, they might say, we'll deal with the top 3 people or whatever. And I'm mentioning this because it is up to you to understand what the agent's process is before you put your offer in, because obviously that's going to influence your strategy.
You made a big point there around like, how are you going to deal with different terms? Is the vendor got a preference for a certain term? Are they going to factor that into the price, or are they not that bothered? I think a lot of people will just skip past that and just think it's always about just the biggest offer. But everyone's, particularly now where, finance is so tight, people haven't got the options of just keeping a property if it doesn't sell for a price option. They have to sell by a certain date, or they want a long settlement because they don't want to rent. And so terms are just a big part of it. But I mean, can you really trust the agent to follow the rules? Like, these are the rules. Do they often change the rules? Yeah.
No, and this can be hard too. At the very start, if I'm ever dealing with an agent who I say, what's your process? He goes, oh, it depends. We'll see how it goes. I say to them, no. I need a process so that I can prepare accordingly, so I can guide my client. I really need to know exactly what's going to happen. And I understand as a buyer, it's going to be hard for you to have these conversations and boss an agent around if you don't have experience. But most of the time, they will have a clear process, which you will only uncover through asking questions. Just remember, the agent might think you know more than you do. So you've got to get to the point where you ask so many questions about their process that at the end you can kind of recap it to them and even email or text them to say, okay, just to be clear, this is how you're going to handle things. And I've done that many times before when I feel like there has been a little bit of ambiguity, and just say, hey, just so I've got this straight, if I give you an offer, you will come back to me. You won't disclose other offers, but I'll get a last chance, whatever they have said, to just make sure that you're all on the same page. Now, coming back to this idea around conditional offers, let's briefly explain what a conditional offer is. For anyone listening to this and saying, I don't know what that means, Chris, what's a conditional offer?
Look, I mean, I think it's with a finance clause often, or I need to still do a building a pest, or I want to get the contract checked. And I mean, from a seller's point of view, I don't really like it, because, I'd want an unconditional. This is once you've agreed and you've signed the contract, it's a deal. I don't want any ambiguity. It's a huge word. This is my 3rd podcast of the day, listeners. But I just want to know it's a done deal. I mean, how often in slow markets, right, conditional offers are fine. Buyers are just willing to try their luck and, they're wanting to be able to pull out. But in hot markets, conditional offers are really hard to sort of get through, particularly in New South Wales. Every seller wants a 66W. What are you finding down in Victoria?
Well, look, in Melbourne, to be competitive, yes, the fewer conditions, the better. But there are some locations, certain states in certain rural areas, regional areas, where finance clauses are the norm. And in which case, you're not necessarily going to impact your offer. But if you are in a position where you don't need a finance clause, always speak with your mortgage broker about this and say, hey, hypothetically, do I need one? What are the risks if I don't have one? Because they might say, yes, you are in an extremely safe position. Here are the risks, but it's fine, versus no, you definitely need one. But essentially, a conditional offer is you saying, my offer is subject to something happening up to, and this imposes a risk to the vendor. So subject to me being happy with a building inspection, subject to my finance being approved, subject to my dog liking the property. It can be anything technically. Obviously, the agent's not going to be excited about the dog clause, but essentially it introduces risk to the vendor because they're not in control of that process then. So yes, if you've got something that's subject to building inspection and someone else has no conditions in the contract, yes, the vendor will prefer the other one, but each vendor is going to have a different sensitivity around risk versus price. I have had instances where I've been subject to finance before, and my offer has been $2,000 more than an unconditional offer. And the vendor said, I'm happy to take the risk. For me, 2,000 is a lot of money and I'm not in a rush. In some other cases, the gap can be 20 or 30 because they have bought something else and they don't want to take the risk. So everyone's going to have different sensitivities, but if you can, the less conditions, the better, just because you can't predict what the vendor's going to, that price differential.
You made a good point there. I mean, does mean speak to your mortgage broker. So that's obviously what I'm going to say. But you're right. A lot of people do think they just need to go to the finance clause and they do want that unconditional loan approval before they get through it. And they create all this stress around that when for us, it's just a formality. We know that buyer has zero issues with getting finance. They're going to have any problems with this property. This is not any risk. This finance is 99.999% likely to happen. Just go unconditional. If that's going to give you a negotiation power and you can potentially get this secured, then do it because you're going to be fine. And we often have those conversations with clients. Even some clients who come to us and they're not pre-approved and we have to act fast because a lot of buyers don't think about finance till it's too late. And then we have to make that sort of decision with them by doing a few checks on their pay slips and their credit file and looking at their savings and just very quickly, even though they haven't got bank pre-approval, just giving them confidence to go, look, this isn't any issues based on what we know.
Yeah. And if you're going to a mortgage broker like Chris, then you can have more confidence around that. But at the same time, if you are, if you're in any kind of risky situation, any kind of quirky situation, if the property does have some quirks to it or concerns, then absolutely. So I have had clients in the past where I said, look, I feel uncomfortable with us not having a finance clause for XYZ reasons. Maybe it's the zoning of the property. Maybe it's because that client, maybe because there's not many comparable sales for that property and I'm a little bit worried about the bank valuation, or I've almost never had problems around that. But then my client didn't have any buffer in case something went wrong. So we have to be careful. But so coming back to all of this, if you are working through a private sale, whether it's online or off market, and you're thinking, well, how do I make my offer the best offer? It can be understanding what are the conditions that I need in there and what are the ways I can maybe have fewer in there. For example, not having a finance clause with your broker's permission or doing your building inspection up front. Now, there's a difference between conditional offers and having conditions in your offers. This is a little bit confusing because you can also have additional conditions in there which don't allow you to exit the contract, but are maybe things that need to be done prior to settlement. For example, the vendor making certain repairs to the property before settlement, or the vendor getting rid of all the rubbish. I've had properties before where there's been an extreme amount of personal items in the garage and under the house and everything. And we put a clause in there to say, that has to be removed prior to settlement. We can't exit the contract if it doesn't happen. But then we have a clause that says something like we can withhold funds to cover the cost of that removal. You have to have some kind of, this is another hot tip. If you have a clause, please don't write it yourself. Get your lawyer to do it. But it can't just say the vendor will remove the rubbish before settlement. Because what if they don't? There's no recourse there. It has to have language like, otherwise, either settlement will be delayed until it's done, which is not as desirable, or you'll withhold money. Now, bear in mind, all of these things need to be negotiated up front. Sometimes they'll say, nah, we're not adding anything to the contract, but if you don't ask, you don't get. But again, the fewer offers, the better. If you put in an offer and it's subject to, the vendor doing a deep clean and the vendor painting all the walls and the vendor doing 10 things, it's going to weaken your offer substantially.
So sometimes these things can take time. Sometimes they can be really fast, right? You've just given insights into the hoarder clause. But if, for example, you are keen on a property and, it is a private sale, do you sort of advise here to get on the front foot, because if there is some things with the property you want to negotiate with the contract, that can go back and forth between two conveyancers or lawyers or whatever you're using. And, it sometimes can take time if you want to add these conditions, because if you were sort of wait to 2 or 3 weeks in, then all of a sudden there's 4 or 5 buyers on it and, they're less likely wanting to do the back and forth with you. Do you find that?
1,000%. And what slows me down the most as a buyer's agent trying to put offers in is solicitors. If I'm needing amendments or requests and changes, I'm waiting days sometimes for a response and the agent's calling them. I haven't heard back. So as soon as you're interested in any property, whether it's a private sale or an auction, you do all of your free due diligence up front, which is, doing your appraisal, doing your council checks, local area checks, all of those things which don't cost any money. And then depending on which legal representative you're using, some will charge to review the contract, some won't. But you might say, well, I'm pretty keen on this property. Let's get the review done straight away. And then if there's anything in that contract, you start to negotiate straight away. I do it via the agent. Perhaps there's other states where the norm is to have the solicitors agree with each other, but I just email the agent and say, hey, here are my requests for the amendments of the contract, whether that be deleting some conditions, adding some conditions, and then they'll get that approved with their vendor and vendor solicitor. So yes, time is absolutely of the essence with a private sale. You don't want to be scrambling last minute, because if an agent gets an offer, sometimes you don't have very long to make a decision.
So we're not going to go through and say, how do you value the property? So you've liked the property,
we've talked about that in the other
we could do
episodes.
about 10 episodes on that. But let's say you've figured out what you want to offer, etc. You know your terms, you've thought about that, your conditions. And you figured out what's the questions you've got to ask the agent around process. And I do feel like this is one of those things where you really can find actually you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to know. And you are on the back foot and you're just crossing your fingers and hoping that it's going to turn out. But if it's your dream property and you've been looking for a while, like you really don't want to be taking these risks. I think it's one of the biggest, one of the many ways buyers agents add values. But so, can you give some ideas? Right. Yeah, give some questions.
So, and this is where I often find people will say to me, oh, the agent was playing games. The agent, I didn't get the property because the agent was playing games. And when I speak to them in more detail, it's because they haven't asked the right questions, which how would you know to ask the right questions? Well, I'm going to tell you in a second. But I also had another person call me recently and they were interested in a property. They'd put an offer in and I said to them, I can help you still. What's the process? How's the agent handling the offers? And they said, I don't know. I didn't ask. So what you need to know about private sales, the main thing is that it's a 2-step process. The first step is that an acceptable offer needs to be made, whether this is by you or someone else. And what I mean by acceptable offer, it doesn't mean the property is sold to that person. It's acceptable to the vendor in terms of price and conditions. So you might put an offer in and at this stage 1, there might be a bit of backwards and forwards. Hey, will you take $1 million, 90-day settlement? Nah, $1,050,000. It goes backwards and forwards at this stage. Or they might straight away say, yeah, we're happy with that. But that doesn't mean that you've bought the property. So whether you submit an acceptable offer or someone else does, that then triggers the second stage, which is dealing with competition if there is any. And this is where it's especially important to understand the process, because you need to know, is that agent then going to come back to you and give you another chance? Is it going to go backwards and forwards? What are the timeframes involved here? So just before we go into this next part of the episode, just remember that 2-stage process.
So what in your mind, what is the first question? So you should be sort of asking, like how deep do you go here as well?
Yeah. So I always at the very beginning, I need to understand more about price. This is not you figuring out how much you're prepared to pay. That's you doing your own homework and research. But with a private sale, there's generally going to be either a set single price advertised or a guide range. Or I appreciate in some states they don't have to, put prices out. But here in Victoria, they have to. So for example, if they've got a range on the statement of information here in Victoria that says 800 to 850, I'll ask them point blank and I'll say, hey, will the top of the range buy this and anything less is negotiable? Is that how you've priced this property? Because they'll just answer me straight away and they'll say, oh, at this stage, yes, 850 buys at anything less will depend. Or they might say, we're just, seeking feedback from the market at the moment. They'll be a little bit more vague. It's just a really easy way to understand at the very beginning what the vendor's expecting. That's just a little bit of tip in terms of price. Use that phrase. But no matter where you are, the questions that you need to ask, the first one is around timeframes. So for example, when can or will the property be sold? Sometimes there's a private sale process where they say, Chris, we're we're accepting offers, and then we're going to present them to the vendor in, the 20th of April.
Yeah.
Or they might say, nope, ready to take offers straight away. Now, they can't take an official offer, or they can't sell the property until there's a contract available. So that's the next question.
Yeah.
But you do want to understand, because you want to, if they're waiting until the 20th of April, you're not necessarily going to give your offer now. So you need to understand timeframes. But then from there, you also need to say, if an acceptable offer is made, whether it's by me or someone else, how long will other people get given to compete? This is really important because the agent might say to you, 24 hours. And then you need to know if a contract's ready, someone else puts an offer in today, that could sell tomorrow. So you need to be ready. I've just had that happen today. I saw a property yesterday. It's got an offer today. It's selling tomorrow. All happens really quickly. And that's very important for you to understand. Or they might say 48 hours, or they might say, nah, if we get an acceptable offer, we've got a couple of hours. This property's been on the market for ages. We're just going to wrap it up.
And I think that's an interesting point you make there where, naturally you would probably think if you make an offer, the vendor is going to see it straight away. But there is sometimes that gap, right? The vendor or the agent say, look, just come around my house on Thursday night and give me an update. I don't really want to know minute by minute. And so
who's going to whose houses these days?
Well, that's true. I did hear some strange thing a couple of weeks ago where the agent went around at 10:30 on a Sunday night. I was like, that person was working ridiculously.
That is a motivated agent needing to sell that property.
And I was like, God, I didn't even people did that. But you're right. So there is that sort of delay sometimes, though, isn't there? That they don't just all of a sudden just take the offers and straight away. And then you're right.
They do need to present. They need to tell that vendor the offer. There's no set rules around they have to do it, within 10 minutes, but they do have to pass that along. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to enact anything. That doesn't mean they're going to do something straight away, because the agent might know, I've got a couple of people doing building inspections tomorrow. I've got another open tomorrow night. We're going to give them a chance to do their own due diligence. So again, you need to question all of this so you understand how quickly things are potentially going to be moving. So once you've understood timeframes, that is, when can the property be sold, or when will it be sold, and how quickly will it be sold once they get an acceptable offer, you need to understand the process. So I just say, if another acceptable offer or my acceptable offer is made, how long will other buyers have to compete? And they might say, again, 24 hours, a couple of hours, 48 hours, whatever it is. But then you've got to say, well, how are you going to handle that? Are you going to go backwards and forwards? Are you going to disclose offers? Is it going to be best and highest? And in which case, does the first person get another chance? Does anyone get another chance? Ask as many questions as you can here until you know exactly how they're going to handle that offer. And if you are genuinely going to get another chance. Some agents will say to me, I'm not going to disclose offers. I think that's unfair. Whereas I'm of the view that it is actually fairer to disclose offers, but I'm never going to have that argument with an agent. I'm never going to change their mind. But you just need to know these things.
Okay, so then they say, whatever they might say, round robin, disclose offers, undisclosed, etc. Is that enough, or we've got to go deeper?
So if they do say, we're going to go backwards and forwards, at that point in time, I will ask them and I'll say, well, how are you going to deal with varying conditions or varying settlement timeframes? They might not have thought about that yet. But it's a really valid question. And at this point in time, you're sort of understanding, hey, is there a particular settlement the vendor wants? You also, depending where you are, if subject to finance is the norm, say to them, are you expecting all the other offers or to be subject to finance? Is that more common around here? How much stronger is a unconditional clause? They'll always say to you, we prefer an unconditional clause, but the vendor's not. They might say the vendor's not fazed by a finance clause. So this is where you ask all of these questions to help you then start formulating your first offer, which may be your last offer if it is best and highest.
And do you also ask here when, other offers are on the table, and how does that all play into it?
I do ask if previous offers have been made, and that sometimes gives me insights into what the vendor's rejected in the past. Because if they say yes, well, if the property is not sold, either that buyer has walked away and not bought the property, or the vendor said no. So just little tidbits of information to help me understand where the vendor's thinking at the moment. And then I would say, because if they said, oh, yeah, we had another offer of 800 grand, and the vendor said no to it, but that was a month ago, they might actually consider that now. So it just helps you with this conversation without point blank saying, what will the vendor sell for specifically, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, or the agent's not willing to give up that information at the start.
Yeah, I think often clients will say, oh, what do I do? And I say, well, you've got to speak to the agent. Like, do I, at this point, they say, and how do I make the offer? Do I email them? Do I text them? Do I call them?
Yeah, you got to ask.
Yeah, because every agent wants it different. And, do I even make an offer now? Or do I just get an unconditional contract or the contract and put it? Do I go to their office and give them their offer? How do you usually play this point?
Yeah, and again, you don't feel silly or don't feel embarrassed asking. I've bought, over 1,500 properties, and I ask every single time because, again, everyone's different. And so don't feel embarrassed about asking all of these different questions. Don't feel like you need to act like you know everything, please. It's I remember when I was first building some townhouses, and I was trying to pretend like I knew more about building than I did with the builder. That didn't last very long. And I ended up asking him everything. So teach me, please. But at this point in time, yeah, you're saying, how do I submit an offer? Is it on a contract of sale? Are you taking email offers at this stage? They might have like a Word document you have to fill out, and then they might only put the final offer on a contract. Having an offer on an actual contract of sale is the most powerful way to do it, because it means if the vendor then signs, it's all a bit of a done deal.
Yeah.
But not every agent does that. They don't. Sometimes if they think they're going to get 10 offers, they don't have time to do all of that. They said email it all through, and then they go from there. So the moral of this whole story so far is ask as many questions until you know exactly what is happening, timeframes, process, how they're accepting offers, how they're going to handle it all. And it is okay to then email or text them as a little bit of a recap summary. I often say, okay, so hypothetically, if this happens, these next steps will all happen. It's not you committing to anything. It's not you saying, I'm going to give you an offer of 800 grand. You say, hypothetically, if someone gave you an offer of X price, that would trigger these steps. Is that right?
And then once you've got that, then I guess it's how do you play? You've got a strategy. You've got a preferred for the agent. That doesn't mean that you have to follow it, right? Like do you sometimes, come in a bit, try a different strategy, or how does it work?
So, I mean, this is where we more have to talk about like negotiations and strategies and everything. But if you're facing a best and highest offer scenario and you try a lowball strategy, that's a terrible strategy because you don't get another chance. So the process will define your strategy. But just remember, there's still that 2 steps that you need to get to a level, you or someone else, where the vendor says yes first, and then you deal with competition afterwards. So if you have a chance and you know you're going to go backwards and highest, you've got more an incentive to try and get the vendor down as low on price in that first phase, because you know that you've got a chance to compete later. But if it's best and highest, then you're not going to have a second chance, and it's really hard. You've got to then figure out, well, what's my walkaway number.
Have you ever had clients where they said, look, yeah, we'll go round robin. We'll have 3 days to, go round. We're just going to have to come around, and you've got a property that client's brief. It's, a great asset. You don't want it to take 3 days, and you've just said, look, I'm willing to offer, 1.2 million, but I want this deal wrapped up in the next 24 hours. Have you found any power in being able to change the strategy?
Okay, great questions. And I'll answer that a couple of ways. First of all, an agent will try their absolute best not to drag out an offer process 3 days once a vendor has said yes to a price, because they can lose buyers during that. Another property could come up, the buyer could change their mind. They actually have an incentive to sell that property as soon as possible. So if they're doing backwards and forwards, in my experience, you might have a couple of hours maximum each time to come back to them and give them an answer. So secondary to that, date stamps they can work in some situations, but in many situations they don't, because if you put a date stamp on there and for whatever reason that expires and you're still interested in the property, you've lost your negotiation ground because they're not going to necessarily believe you again when you put another firm position on the table.
Yeah.
So I use date stamps when I do generally have a reason that I'm going to withdraw. I've got another property that's going to auction that weekend, or I've got other options, or in conjunction with the agent saying, and I say to them, hey, do you think this vendor needs a date stamp? Do you feel like they need a little bit of a fear of loss to manage this? Because I do have that relationship with a lot of agents where I can have those conversations. Buyers can try that, but I just don't think in many cases it's effective. You can impose another type of fear of loss by actually saying, hey, no, I've got this other property.
Yeah.
Make sure you have a property that's a similar price range that's that you can bring up if they ask, which one? Oh, I can't tell you.
Maybe not one they're actually selling and they know you haven't looked at it, and or it's in their network of agency, or they know that agent quite well. So maybe actually go and look at the property and ask for a contract on it as well to at least show that you might be interested in it.
Especially if it's within their own agency and they know who's actually been through. That's a real way for them to call bluff. But to answer the overall question, Chris, is I have successfully in the past, though not often, changed the process, especially in some situations where it has been best and highest and I've managed to twist the agent's arm to not do it that way, or a few times when I've made it a best and highest because we had nothing to lose in doing it that way. So you can sometimes, but it's not easy to do.
So much we covered in that. I mean, really, we were just talking about, the process of making offers and the questions you need to ask and the DD you need to do and getting ready early rather than later. But all those things are huge in the buying process. And it just shows how complicated and how many steps in the process and how many, hand grenades you can sort of stand on. So thanks so much, Amy. Always enjoy doing these. If you want to work with Amy, there's links in the show notes. If you want to work with myself or my team, just check out the show notes as well. Thanks so much for
awesome.
chat.
Thanks, Chris. See you next time.
Talk next time.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.